I grew up in the Cold War. The Russians, they were the enemy, and the enemy was very close. They were only a few hundred kilometers from our borders, and the Russians, they could overrun our country in a matter of hours. So the Cold War was always a subject. It was on the radio, in the newspapers, on the television, and it was always good for a discussion on school. And that was about mutual deterrence, about possible disarmament, but the most important topic was a nuclear war, and then the fear for a nuclear war. Many years after that, when I was working as a professional photographer, I was already working on projects about the consequences of the Cold War. And this was always about people. But of course there are different angles to visualize a conflict, a war. And for example, you can photograph the landscape of the Cold War, the architecture, the infrastructure. And then by then the Cold War was already over, and I wanted to photograph the remnants, what was left behind of this, the infrastructure of this conflict, the conflict I grew up in. So all these sites which were left by the Russians, they were in a kind of a new phase. It was deserted, neglected. And well, nobody cares about it anymore, and so nature kind of took over. So this decay, it also symbolizes the end of an era, and these are the locations I was looking for. Several of these locations, you could see that they had had more layers of history. For example, in Altengrabov in Saxon, there is an old shooting range, and it's over 100 years old. The troops of the Kaiser used it to do target practice for World War I. And you can still see it. If you look at the picture, you see this old bunker. It is built during this time. The Kaiser left, the Nazis came, and they prepared on that location for World War II. The Nazis left and the Russians arrived. You can see that by the old Soviet tank, which is being used for target practicing. So they left their marks in the landscape, and the Russians left, and then the Bundeswehr did their practicing there, and you can see that by the signpost, the red signpost in the back of the picture. So you see several kinds of layers, kinds of history in one photograph, and these are the interesting locations for me. So when I started with shooting these locations in Brandenburg, I thought I would be working on this for about 1 year. But having visited several of these places, I found it so fascinating that I knew I had to expand the project, because the Russians were not only in Brandenburg, they were all over Eastern Europe, and then there was the other side, Western Europe. So in order to do this, I needed more information. So I started doing research. So I talked to a lot of people who played some kind of a role in the Cold War. For example, retired army generals or people of the peace movement, and that gave me a lot more background and also interesting information. For example, I talked with people of the political party, the Grünen in Germany, and they gave me this map. And on this map you could find all locations in East and West Germany where during the Cold War nuclear weapons were stored. So very useful instruments for me. When I had a list of possible locations, then I went off for a few weeks and visited the locations one by one. And the main criterion I used was such a place has to be authentic. So it had to be in the same state as it was when the last troops left it. What I wanted to include in this series was a part of the German wall, the wall that divided East and Western Germany. I didn't want to shoot it in Berlin because it has been photographed so many times that for me it's not interesting anymore. But there are also pieces of the inner German border, and they are still there. But if I was there, I noticed that the barbed wire was new. The wall had fresh paint on it, so it was a kind of a museum. So there were also pictures I never took. I did manage, however, to find the last remaining piece of the inner German border, and that was in a location between Thüringen and Bayern, and in a very authentic state. I found a very nice place in Grima, in a Russian army barrack, and there was this dormitory for Russian soldiers. And this dormitory was completely intact, so there were beds, with sheets on it. It was like these people, they got up there this morning and they did their thing, but the last Russian soldier left there six years earlier, but it was still in the same state, so really a gem for me. A strange place I photographed was the Teufelsberg in Berlin. In World War II, Berlin was heavily bombed, and after the war, the debris of these bombed houses was transported out of the city. And from the debris, they built a kind of a hill, and this hill became bigger and bigger and bigger. And the people who lived around it, they called it the Devil's Mountain, Teufelsberg. So when this hill was finished, the Americans came, the NSA, the National Security Agency, and on top of this hill, they built a spy station. And from the spy station, they could monitor radio traffic from the Russians. And of course, it is deserted now, but the infrastructure is still there. So when you come there, you can still see it. You see these very big white balloons, which were the radar stations, and it's a very strange image because it looks like a space station from a different planet. It's really bizarre. One of my favorite photographs is this one. You see a bunker on an old Soviet naval base. And it looks a kind of artificial, but it's not. It's really authentic. You see a bunker in the sea, in a moving sea. All the relics I photographed for this series are things, objects. But I also wanted to include a biographical element. So I knew that the Russians, they had their own towns in Germany. And I found this biographical element on the Russian army cemeteries in Germany. Because on these cemeteries, you sometimes find on the gravestones portraits of deceased people, of deceased soldiers. And I needed this biographical element to show that this is a war about people. I had an exhibition of this work, and then a couple came to me and they told me, this Russian torture room you have photographed, so it is so terrible, it's horrendous. I mean, if you imagine what these people did there with all this torturing. And I was thinking by myself, a Russian torture room? I've never made a picture of a Russian torture room. I don't know if they exist, Russian torture rooms. So I asked them, what photograph are you referring to? And it turned out to be that it was a photograph of a room with a chair in a hospital, in a Russian army hospital. It was not a place for torture, it was a place for healing. So these people, out of their prejudgment, totally misinterpreted such an image. Very interesting. So I was driving in Kaliningrad in Russia, and on my way I saw this very old, neglected military building, and I could tell it was from the Cold War. It was old. So I got out of my car and I grabbed a camera and I took a few pictures. I walked around the building and then I saw two Russian soldiers lying in grass, drinking beer, and then I thought, well, hey, this is not a deserted place. This is an active base, so I should better leave. But the next moment, I was seized by 2 guards, and they arrested me and took me to a Russian army base. So I was held the whole day in this base. So there came this officer from the FSB, which was formerly the KGB, and he interrogated me the whole day. So he wanted to know, who are you? What are you doing here? He wanted to know everything. So in the end, he accepted my explanation of my photo projects, and I could leave. But I lost my films. They confiscated them. So, but all in all, it felt a little bit like the Cold War, but then 10 years after the end of the Cold War. I'm very happy with this project because it shows the impact of the Cold War on society by showing its landscape. And that's a different angle. So in the Cold War, thousands and thousands of military installations were built all over Europe, and they look identical on both sides of the Iron Curtain, and they were all built out of the same fears. And if you look at these photographs today, then you might sense a kind of aesthetics, even a kind of beauty, the beauty of decay. But if you think about the purpose, why these things were built, the destructive purpose, then you might feel a little uneasy. And because you can sense the echoes of distrust and aggression. So what you are looking at are kind of physical reminders of how things were and how things could be once again. And on the other hand, you can also say, today we live under a constant threat of terrorism. We have threat alerts. Are things really that different today?